Maseches Yevamos Daf Lamed Aleph discusses the sugya of a suffix marriage of an erva. What is the halacha of her tzara? And we are going to see that there is a case of suffix kedushin which is mentioned in the Mishnah, and the case of suffix gerushin which is not mentioned. The Gemara is going to want to know why it's listed by kedushin and not by gerushin. The Gemara will try a number of different approaches to explain it, and then end off saying that really it is intended to be said for both cases. Towards the end of the daf, we'll get to the sugya of a woman who falls to Yibum from two different husbands at the same time. So let's begin. We've seen that there's discussion of a situation in which Reuven is married to one woman for sure, we'll call her the tzara, and a second woman who is a suffix if he's married to her or not. That suffix is a erva to Shimon. So when both of them fall to Yibum to Shimon, if the erva is married to Reuven, then her tzara is pater from the mitzvah of Yibum. If the erva is not married, then the tzara is chayav in the mitzvah of Yibum. Now, the Gemara has two very different discussions. One is where you have a suffix kedushin, and one is where you have a suffix gerushin. And these are opposites because of what the pre-existing condition was. Suffix kedushin means that we don't know if the erva was ever married to Reuven, and therefore the pre-existing condition is that the erva was not married to Reuven. The erva was not married to Reuven. That means that the tzara was the only wife, and the tzara therefore falls to Yibum. She's not a tzara's erva. That's the pre-existing condition, unless the suffix kedushin really actually happened, and that means she can't do Yibum. She's a tzara's erva, and she would be free to go to the shuk completely. The opposite case is if the erva was definitely married to Reuven and there's a suffix divorce. There, the pre-existing state was that the tzara is a tzaras erva and she's free to go to the shuk and she doesn't do yibum. Question is, did something change that, and that divorce happened and the erva is now out of the picture and therefore she is not a tzaras erva and she could do yibum? Now the Mishnah had listed that the halacha in all cases of suffix kedushin and suffix gerushin is that she gets chalitza and not yibum. However, is one case that could have been mentioned in both suffix gerushin, both suffix kedushin and suffix gerushin, but is only mentioned in suffix kedushin, and that's where the kedushin is thrown to the woman. And it's a suffix if it fell in her rishos or if it fell in the husband's rishos. That could have also been listed in the case of suffix gittin, where it's a suffix if the get fell in her rishos or in her husband's rishos, but it's not listed. The implication, therefore, is as follows: when a suffix kedushin is thrown, we give a psak that she needs to get chalitza. We consider it to be a suffix if she was ever mekudeshes, and therefore her tzara is a suffix whether she's a tzaras erva or not, and she needs to get chalitza. However, in the case of suffix gerushin, we don't say that she's a suffix tzaras erva. We go with the chazaka. The pre-existing condition was that she is a tzaras erva, and therefore she does not do yibum. She doesn't do chalitza. She's free to go to the shuk. The Gemara wants to know what is the difference between these two. Why is that the halacha? So the Gemara first says, really the halacha is that we should follow chazaka. In the case of suffix gerushin, the chazaka should be that she does yibum. In the case of suffix gerushin, the halacha is that she does nothing. She's free to go to the shuk. However, we're going to be machmir in the case of the suffix kedushin, and we're going to say do chalitza and do not just go ahead and do yibum. Be machmir. Don't encounter a potential eshes ach and do chalitza. Now the Gemara asks that this chumrah is a terrible chumrah because this chumrah includes a lot of potential problems. Problems are is that when people see that she does chalitza and she's not being allowed to do yibum, people are going to assume if she's not being allowed to do yibum, she must really be a tzaras erva. If she's really a tzaras erva, that means that the erva is married to her husband. If the erva is married to her husband, so then people will assume that if the husband were to go and to marry somebody else who is a sister of that wife, that kedushin is not chal. Or if this woman goes and marries somebody else, then that kedushin is not a good marriage because she's married to somebody else. And then if she gets out of her first marriage, she's not married to the second marriage. These are all big kulas. So we can't give off the impression by making her do chalitza and not yibum that she really was not allowed to do yibum because her tzara was married. So that is a kula, not a chumrah. Now, the Gemara doesn't spell it out here, but it comes up later. The same potential problem could happen in the case of a suffix gerushin. If we say that the gerushin she's not considered to be free to go to the shuk, that means we're requiring chalitza. That sends a message that we're assuming that she's not a tzaras erva, and that the erva is not married to her husband, and that the erva is free to marry anybody else. But that's not necessarily true. She's a suffix, and we're assuming actually that the halacha is that she is still married. So why is that allowed? So the Gemara says simply because there's no problem, because we're not just saying that the case of Kedushin she's allowed to just she's not allowed to do Yibum. We're not just saying that she's free to go to the shuk. We're saying she still requires chalitza. The fact that we're saying that she still requires chalitza means that she's clearly not a regular tzaras erva. We're not allowing her to do Yibum because she might be a tzaras erva, but she's clearly not assumed to be a tzaras erva because we're requiring chalitza. So the Gemara says if that's true, then in the case of the Gerushin, we should use the same suffix. Again, we could still say the same thing. We could say that we could also be machmir in the case of the Gerushin, and we should say that we'll be machmir that she should require chalitza, and she can't just marry whoever she wants. She can't just go free to the shuk. Now, you may tell me, but people are going to assume the wrong halacha. People are going to assume that if we're not allowing her to marry to the shuk, that her tzara, that the erva is married, and that's tremendous kula, but people will still see that we're not just allowing her to go to the shuk, we're not allowing her to do Yibum, we're requiring chalitza, and obviously therefore they'll see it as just a chumrah. So Gemara says there's a problem with that. You can't just be machmir to require chalitza, because if you make people do chalitza, they often make a mistake, and they say, well, if she could do chalitza, then she could do Yibum, and we don't want her to do Yibum. During Yibum would be usher. So the Gemara says, well, how is that different in the case of Safek Kedushin? There also, if you allow her to do chalitza, she'll do Yibum. So the Gemara says, there's no problem, because there the main halacha in the case of Safek Kedushin is that we assume that the Kedushin was no good because we follow chazaka, and therefore she's a tzaras erva, and therefore the tzara is not a tzaras erva, and she's allowed to do Yibum. So if people make a mistake because we said that she should do chalitza, and they go ahead and do Yibum, fine. That's the main halacha anyway. However, in the case of the Gerushin, we cannot be machmer that she should do chalitza, because if we allow her to do chalitza, if we say she should do chalitza, instead of being free to the shuk, people are going to say, well, if she could do chalitza, then she could also do Yibum, and if she could do Yibum, that would be a terrible thing, because the halacha really is that we're supposed to follow chazaka, and the Gerushin was no good, and she is a tzaras erva, so we can't allow that. So now the Gemara says, there's a kash on this concept that you're telling me that we don't allow people to do chalitza in the case of a suffix, tzaras erva, because maybe they're going to end up doing Yibum, and that's aser. And that's because we have a question which is very similar, where we have a suffix tzaras erva, where the chazaka was that she was a tzaras erva, and we don't know whether that state ended, and yet we say choletzes. What's that case? The case is we're not sure if the erva has died or not. So the Mishnah says as follows. So if you have Ruvain, who's married to two women, one of the women is an erva to Shimon, so she's the erva, and then the other one's a tzaras erva. But Ruvain and the erva are both in house. The house collapses, and they both die. We don't know who died first. Now, if the erva died first, that means by the time Ruvain died, the erva was already out of the marriage, and therefore his only wife is the tzara, and the tzara falls to Yibum, and she's chayav in Yibum. If, however, Ruvain died before the tzara, before the erva, then the time that he died, the tzara was a tzaras erva, and she is free to go to the shuk. There, the halacha is that she requires chalitza. Now, the chazaka should be that she's considered to be becheskas heter l'shuk. Cheskas heter l'shuk, because before either of them died, this woman was going to be mutter l'shuk because she was a tzaras erva. Yet, even though the chazaka says she should be considered to be mutter to the shuk and she's also her to do yibum, we still say that we make her do chalitza, and we don't say, well, if we allow chalitza, then she'll end up doing yibum, which is aser. So why not? How is it different than the case of the Gerushin, where you're saying we don't say we do not say it could just be machmer to do chalitza, because then they'll end up doing yibum, which is aser. So Gemara offers two answers. The Gemara, first of all, says the house collapsing on people is uncommon. We don't make gzeres in an uncommon case. We only make gzeres in the case of Gerushin, which is common. The other answer is that the Gemara says is that in the case over there is no way for people to think that the Beis Din figured out who died first. How is Beis Din supposed to know? Beis Din will not say that she should do yibum. People will not say she should do yibum, because people understand that the Beis Din are just being machmer for chalitza because they don't know what happened. they're not going to say, oh, the Beis Din figured it out. How are they supposed to know? They weren't there. However, in the case of the Gerushin, if they see that we're making her do chalitza, then it means that obviously we're assuming that she was not a tzaras erva, and therefore the Beis Din must have figured out what the psak halacha is b'toras vada in the case of the safek gerushin, and therefore they'll say, so she's out of tzaras erva, so if she could do chalitza, so then she could do yibum. But in the other case, you wouldn't have that concern. Okay. Now the Gemara has another case of the gerushin, though, where we say that it requires chalitza, and we have a very similar mishnah to ours. It says if the man and his wife are standing in Rosh Hashanah, and he throws her a get, so it's called migureshes ve'ena migureshes if it landed halfway between them. We don't know who it landed closer to. If it's closer to her, she's divorced. If it's closer to him, then she's not divorced. Halfway in between, then it's called divorced and not divorced. What does that mean halachically? That means if he's a Kohen, he's usher to her because she might be divorced, and Grusha is usher to be with a Kohen. If though she had an erva, and you have a case of if though she had a tzara, that is, and she was an erva, and it's a case of tzaras erva, so she requires chalitza. So why does she require chalitza here? Why don't you say the same thing? We should be just like our case, and we should say you can't allow her to do chalitza because up chazaka she's considered to be a tzaras erva, and if you allow her to do chalitza, she'll end up doing yibum. That's the Gemara's kasha. So the Gemara answers. The Gemara says, Rabbi and Rav Yosef say that the answer is that there's a different type of suffix here. It's not that we don't know where it landed. So we have two pairs of witnesses. One comes and says it landed closer to her, and one says that it comes and landed closer to him. When you have a pair of witnesses against a pair of witnesses, the halacha is that's called a suffix de'oraisa. Suffix de'oraisa means there is no chazaka. Chazaka doesn't work, and that's because chazaka is overpowered by two witnesses. You have two witnesses that stand and say edus that overrides and completely obliterates any chazaka that there is. So the chazaka is useless. You have witnesses against witnesses. All chazakas are obliterated, and it's a 50-50. Therefore, there is no chazaka, so we have to go with chalitza. We have to go with the middle of the road psak. But there's no main halacha that she really is motor l'shok, and yibum is asur. There's no such thing. So Gemara says, well, then in our case of our Mishnah, maybe we're also talking about two pairs of edim. Why can't we say the case of safek karav lo? We don't know if the get fell in her rishos or not, and it's talking about where there's two pairs of edim, and you go with chalitza. Why does our Mishnah say that? Our whole question is, why doesn't Mishnah say this case? It could say that case. The Gemara says no, because if our Mishnah said the case, it would have to be talking about where it was only one witness against one witness, and therefore halachically we should follow chazaka. So Gemara says, how do you know? Why should we talk about one witness against one witness? Because the case of Kedushin has to be a case of one witness against one witness. Because if it was a case of two witnesses against two witnesses, then she should be able to do yibum with no problem. We should follow chazaka and she should do yibum. Gemara says, what? That's totally backwards. In the case of two witnesses against two witnesses, you just told me you don't do yibum. Additionally, you're telling me that in the case of gerushin, where there's two witnesses against two witnesses, you can't follow chazaka. That's not true. I will show you that two witnesses against two witnesses, you do follow chazaka. And the Gemara quotes a case. There was a person named Bar Shatya who used to vacillate between being a healthy individual and being a person with not control of his mental faculties. Sometimes he was healthy, sometimes he was a shota. He sold a piece of land, and the question is, when he sold the land, did he know what he was doing and therefore the sale counts? Or did he not know what he was doing because he was a shota and therefore the sale doesn't count? And you have two witnesses against two witnesses, and the halacha is that you follow chazaka, it stays in the possession of Bar Shatya. So therefore you say you do follow chazaka even in case of two witnesses against two witnesses. So we're back to our question: what is the difference between our Mishnah where we don't have the case of safek karav law by gerushin and the other Mishnah where you do? So Abaye therefore says in our Mishnah, even though we didn't say the case of throwing the get, we meant to say it as well. We said it in the case of Kedushin, and whatever we said by Kedushin applies by Gerushin as well. I don't have to repeat it. And for that matter, says Abaye, whatever I said by Gerushin applies by Kedushin as well. All those different types of sfeikos that were mentioned by Gerushin and not by Kedushin apply there also. Now Rava says something similar, except he says only one way. He says the suffix of throwing, it's said by Kedushin and it's meant to be understood to apply to Gerushin as well, however, it doesn't go the other way. Not everything that was said by Gerushin applies to Kedushin. And that, Rava says, is learned out from the fact that after each phrase, it said, Zehu. This is the case of Safek Kedushin. That means to exclude that the other case, something else, which is listed later by Safek Gerushin, is not that doesn't count as a suffix kiddushin. Now, even though it says zehu about suffix gerushin, also that's not necessarily meaning to exclude anything. That's just because we said it in the beginning by suffix kiddushin, so we'll say it later by suffix gerushin as well. But suffix kiddushin is where we say this is a suffix kiddushin meant to exclude something else. What's it excluding? So it's excluding a case where a document did not have the time written on it. We said that in the case of a document of gerushin, the get, it doesn't have the time written on it, that's a suffix if it's a good get or not, and therefore that's a case of suffix gerushin. However, kiddushin could also be done with a document. You could have a shtar kiddushin, right? A woman could be mekudeshes bekesef b'shtar u'b'bia. So that document doesn't have to have the time on it, doesn't have to have the date. So if it doesn't have the date, that's not a suffix. It doesn't count as a suffix. That's a good kiddushin. So now the Gemara is interested to know, why does a shtar kiddushin not have to have the date? How is it different than a get? The Gemara says, well, there's two explanations as to why a get requires a date. One of them I understand why it doesn't apply to kiddushin, the other I don't. The two explanations are as follows. Explanation number one is that the husband has rights to take the produce of his wife's possessions when they are married. And if you put the wrong date on it, then the husband will fudge the date, and the husband will take the fruits, the produce of his wife's possessions, even after the marriage has ended. So therefore you have to have the right date on the shtar in order to know when his rights in the wife, in the possessions, in the produce of the possessions of his wife stop. Now, as far as kiddushin, you don't need that, because his rights don't begin by kiddushin, they begin by nesuin, so it doesn't matter what the date of kiddushin is. However, the other explanation as to why you need a date on the get is as follows, and that is we're afraid people are going to fudge the date for the following reason. Let's say a man is married to his niece. He's married to his sister's daughter, and therefore he has a special regard for her. And then he sees that she's being mizana. She's engaging in adulterous behavior, which condemns her to the death penalty. However, because she's his niece, he wants to save her. So what he's going to do is he's quickly going to write a get, and he's going to fudge the date that this get happened before this adulterous incident happened. And even if she's convicted, he could say, oh, she was divorced, and therefore she's not guilty of the death penalty. However, that's bad because that's not the correct halacha. Now, the same thing could apply in the case of kiddushin, and that is he could fudge the date of the shtar kiddushin to show that she was really not married yet at the time of the adulterous relationship, so you should have the same concern. So why do we not put a date on the kiddushin? So the Gemara says, the answer is because most kiddushin is done with money, and therefore we follow all the halachas of money. Money can't have a date, and therefore the shtar doesn't have to have a date. The Gemara says, well, what about the shtar of an eved? The sale of an eved could be done either with just money or with a shtar, and yet we put a date on that shtar, we put a date on that contract. So we should say the same thing. The money doesn't have a date, so the contract shouldn't have to have a date. So no, the majority of sales of an eved are done with a contract, not just with money. Therefore, we follow the majority rule of a contract, and that is with a date. However, by kiddushin, the majority is with money, and therefore we follow the rules of money, which goes without a date. The Gemara offers a second answer, and that's that a shtar kiddushin, there's no point in having money on it, because either way it's vulnerable to be changed. What are you going to do with the shtar? Where will it stay? If it stays in the possession of the woman, then the same concern if she has an adulterous behavior and she wants to affect it, so she'll erase the date. Then you'll have a shtar kiddushin without a date. You won't be able to give her the penalty that she deserves because you don't know if she was married at the time that adultery happened. If you leave it with the man, so we have the same concern. He could still erase it. He could still, if it's his niece, he could still do the same thing. The only other option is to leave it with the witnesses. That won't help either, because the witnesses have to remember when the condition happened in order for them to testify based on that. If they can't testify, then just showing the document doesn't help, because the witnesses cannot say testimony based on what they read. They have to say it based on what they know. So the Gemara says, so then the same thing should apply to the get. What are you going to do with the get? Wherever you leave it, you can have the same problem. You leave it in possession of the man, he'll fudge the date. You leave it in possession of the woman, she'll fudge the date. And you can't leave it with the Edom either. So Gemara says, no, it's very different. In the case of the get, the woman needs to have the date on there. Because if she has the case of the znus, and we don't know when she got married, when she got divorced, and she's going to claim, oh, I was divorced already, if she doesn't have a date on there, we're not going to believe her. We're going to say that we assume that you were not divorced. We assume that you were married just as you were before, and therefore she'll get the penalty that she deserves. The date is coming to help her by saying, I was already divorced at that time. Kiddushin works the other way. She was not married, and we don't know whether she was married at the time of this adulterous relationship or not. So she'll erase the date, and then she'll say, prove that I was married at that time. You don't know. So just by erasing the date, she'll be able to solve the problem. Therefore, we'll have no purpose in having the date on the Shtar Kiddushin, but there is a purpose in having it on the Shtar Gerushin, even if it'll stay in her possession. Alright, now we get to our next Mishnah. Next Mishnah discusses a situation in which one woman falls to Yibum from two husbands, and that's using the concept of Maimer. So you have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven is married to a woman, and the way the Mishnah describes it is all three brothers are married to wives that are unrelated to each other. So Reuven dies, his wife falls to Yibum to Shimon, and Shimon does Maimer. Shimon does Maimer, which is a quasi kind of Yibum. Yibum is supposed to be without Kiddushin. It's just supposed to be a marriage relationship that is affect the Yibum. But this fellow did Kiddushin, which is called Maimer, when he was supposed to do Yibum. He never actually consummated the relationship until Shimon himself, he also died. And then those two women now fell to Yibum to Levi. Now, the second wife, the one who was not married to Reuven, is definitely falling to Yibum to Levi. That's not an issue. The one who was married to Reuven and then got Maimer from Shimon, so here you have a machlokes. Tanakama says she has a quasi Yibum from Shimon. She's quasi married to Shimon. She has quasi Yibum. Therefore, she fell to Yibum from Reuven to Levi, and she is quasi falling to Yibum from Shimon to Levi. So she's falling to Yibum from two different husbands, and that's not allowed. The Torah says umeis echad mehem, one of the brothers dies. Doesn't say two brothers died. You gotta fall to Yibum from only one brother. There's no mitzvah even when somebody falls from two brothers. Now, Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Rabbi Shimon says there's no quasi. It's a suffix. We don't know if she's considered to be married to Shimon or if she's not considered to be married to Shimon. That being the case, she could do Yibum either way. If she's married to Shimon, then her relationship with Reuven is totally absolved. There's no Zika anymore. She's Shimon's wife. She's falling to Yibum from Shimon. If she's falling to Yibum from, if the Maimer counts as nothing, she's falling to Yibum from Reuven, and then there's no problem. Now, he can't do Yibum to both women because they might both be falling to Yibum from Shimon. And he can't just let both women, he can't let the second one go free because she might be falling to Yibum. One might be falling to Yibum from Reuven and one from Shimon. So therefore he does Yibum with whichever one he wants, and the other one requires Chalitza misafik. The Tanakama, though, held that the halacha is they both require chalitza. So now the Gemara says, I don't understand why they both require chalitza. You're telling me that the Torah said you can only come to Yibum from one man and not from two. That means this woman is excluded from Yibum altogether. So she shouldn't require chalitza. She should require nothing. So the Gemara says it's midrabanan. Midairaisa, we don't consider the Maimer to be anything, and therefore they're falling to Yibum from two different men, and they should both be able to do Yibum. Midrabanan, we're afraid that it looks like they're both Shimon's wife, and therefore people are going to say if he does Yibum to both of them, then you can do Yibum to two women that are married to the same husband. A woman and her tzara could both do Yibum. That's not true. The Torah says only one of them could do Yibum, the other one is an Eser Eshesach. Therefore we insist on Chalitza. Someone says, why do they both have to do Chalitza? Let one of them do Yibum and the other one do Chalitza. So there's another gzeira there. The first one could do Yibum. The second one would be Aser, because the second one has to do Chalitza. We would be afraid that if she does Yibum too, then people will think that two women from the same husband can both do Yibum. However, if we allow first one to do Yibum and the second one to do Chalitza, we're afraid that the opposite will occur, and then the first one will do Chalitza, and the later one will do Yibum, and that would be an Isser if they both came from the same husband, and that may occur again in a different case. So the Gemara says, okay, accept that. And then the Gemara says a statement of Rava. The Gemara says, what happens if the one who did Maimer gives a get? He gives a divorce document to her. So there's two versions of what Rava says. According to one version, Rava says that's back to square one. The get undoes the Maimer, and now you have two women falling to Yibam from two different husbands. One fell from Reuven, one fell from Shimon. There's no problem, they could both do Yibam. According to the second version, no, we're still concerned. We're still concerned that people are going to see the get, and they're going to think that if a Yavam gives a get to the Yevama, he's allowed to go ahead and do Yibam afterwards. That's not true if he's giving a get to break the Zika. Giving a get to break the Zika doesn't happen. In this case, he's just giving a get to undo the Maimer. That's fine. We're referring to where Shimon gave the get. But if someone gives a get and then to have him go ahead and say that she falls to Yibam, and then he's allowed to be miyabim her, that would be usher. It's not true. A woman who gets a get is not allowed to do Yibam afterwards if her megaresh dies because she's an Eishes.